Hello. This screencast lecture is going to cover the first of our Persian Gulf region nations, and this is going to be about the nation of Iran. To begin with, let's take a look at uh, the geography of the region and place Iran here, looking at its surrounding neighbors. You can see that Iran has a long coastline that's on the Persian Gulf right here, and it holds a very strategic position related to oil producing nations of the region. This entrance into the Persian Gulf is the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran, of course, has the shoreline area um, opposite of the United Arab Emirates and Oman. And as a result, they, for the most part, control a major portion of what is about a 20-mile wide navigable area where huge amounts of the world's oil supply exit from this region. So it's a very strategic location, and Iran has an important position that they play there. They share a long border with Iraq, and then, of course, over to the eastern side of Iran, you have the nation of Afghanistan, also very significant within the region, and then down here is the nation of Pakistan. So, background information on Iran. First of all, they're an interesting country because they have the form of government that is a theocracy, which means that they are a religious um, controlled government that is controlled by the Islamic leadership of the country. They do have a president, um, President Hassan Rouhani, served as president for a number of years, but the religious council is who really controls the country, and the leader of the religious council is the Ayatollah um, Khamenei, who has been in that position of power for a couple of decades, actually longer than a couple of decades. U.S. has a long relationship with Iran, going all the way back to World War II. They have held a strategic position, significant at that time because to the north of Iran during World War II would be the nation of the Soviet Union. And of course, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union, trying to give them assistance against the Nazis. And our interest in Iran began because we wanted to make sure that this region was under Allied control. And Iran had a leader at the time who was sympathetic to the Nazi regimes. And so the U.S. Overthrew that leader and placed his son in power. We'll talk about his son in a little bit. Um, but that became kind of the first U.S. interest in the region. U.S. relationships with Iran continued after World War II because of the beginning of the Cold War. And once again, Iran shared this border with the Soviet Union. So the United States then wanted a nation that was friendly to us and opposed to the communist regime in the Soviet Union. So once again, we stayed involved in Iranian politics, and we kept their government from coming under control of a socialist system. They had a leader by the name of Mossadegh, a prime minister, who the United States staged an overthrow of his leadership in order to try to get sympathetic leadership in power. And the person that we wanted in power was the son of the original Iranian leader that we overthrew back in the Second World War period. We'll talk about that guy shortly, and he comes up as part of this next story. The person that we supported was the Shah of Iran, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the way the United States went from becoming a close Iranian friend and ally at least to the Shah anyway, was in 1979 when the Shah's leadership was overthrown and American diplomatic personnel were held hostage by the revolutionaries. But to think about like why that was taking place has a lot to do with the leadership of the Shah's government. The Shah was very pro-Western, tried to implement a lot of reforms that modernized the country and stayed friendly with the United States in these modern reforms. He was also very anti-communist. But the fact that he did these things cannot be completely, dismissed. But the reality is that he also had a very repressive government that used secret police and torture against his political opponents. And he used a lot of the oil income of the country to enrich himself. American oil companies were very highly invested in Iran, and we had a large economic interest there. But the government of Iran, run by the Shah, they pocketed a lot of the oil revenues that were coming into the country through the oil trade. So ultimately, what happens is the U.S. went from being close friends and allies with Iran to becoming one of their most despised enemies over a series of events. I'm leaving a short history of Iran for you to watch as a separate video, so that will go through some of the issues dealing with the Iranian hostage crisis. I'm going to skip through that right now because you'll watch that at a later time. The issues today with Iran is that we've had a long series of ups and downs over the years since the Iranian revolutionaries overthrew the Shah of Iran. And those issues involve a lot of the turmoil of the Middle East just in general. The same year that the Shah was overthrown, the nation of Iran and Iraq went to war with each other and fought a long conflict of about 8 years in length, which more than 1 million Iranians and Iraqis died during that conflict. We'll talk about that conflict a little bit more when we discuss the nation of Iraq. But during that time, the U.S. was at least partially funding the nation of Iraq in their fight against Iran. And so, of course, that had a lot of the implications of what caused the Iranians to continue to be angry at the United States. And other events, which I've included on this bolded point list, in the mid-1980s, the United States military accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner as it flew over the Persian Gulf under the belief that it was an aircraft that might be attacking U.S. warships. And that airliner was destroyed with all of the Iranian civilian passengers on board. To make it even worse, they were heading to the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. And certainly the United States did apologize and offered reimbursement, money to the families of the victims of the attack. But the fact remains that the United States did kill several hundred Iranian citizens at that time. But other components that have continued to cause problems between our country, Iran has attempted to pursue a nuclear energy program, which our concerns have always been that they could turn that nuclear energy program into an attempt to build nuclear weapons. President Obama was able to negotiate a treaty with the Iranians to try to diminish some of the concerns about weapons development that we believe were there in return for offering an ending to long-term sanctions that the U.S. had on Iran, which if you look at here, these economic sanctions have been going on for 40 plus years now. not allowing Iran to have open trade with the outside world to prevent them from having political and economic power. President Trump, of course, has opposed that agreement and went back on the agreement with the Iranians, and we have no agreement in place right now that's really functioning. These economic sanctions have been, of course, a big sticking point between us and the Iranians. It's not they've not been completely successful, obviously, because they've been put in place to try to punish the Iranian government for actions such as the taking hostage of American diplomats back in the late 70s, but continuing other issues that we're trying to prevent them from doing or punish them for doing, including their support of different terrorist organizations over the years, their continued opposition to the nation of Israel, where Iran's been one of the main opponents of Israeli power in the region. And if you look at things now, currently, one of the big things that's happening, which we'll get into in our next topic areas, again, when we talk about Iraq, is that as Iraq has weakened in the region as a result of the early 2000s US invasion, the Iranians have really stepped in to try to fill some of this void of power within the region, especially again as the United States now has pulled out of the region more and more during the Trump administration. The Iranians have been involved in the civil war that's taking place in Yemen, that we'll talk about that a little bit later, and as a result has come into a lot of conflict with Saudi Arabia, who is a main ally of the United States. So in a quick kind of a couple sentence summary, Iran went from being one of the closest allies that the United States had in the region in the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s to becoming one of the strongest opponents of the United States in the region. And if any kind of long-term kind of peaceful decisions are ever made within the regions, it's going to have to come with some type of lessening of tension and negotiations between the United States and Iran.